Welcome, everyone. I'm Michelle Gold, Board Chair at Holocaust Museum, LA. Thank you all for joining us for an important and timely Building Bridges. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Building Bridges is a monthly discussion series that brings together leaders of community organizations for a conversation about working toward common social justice goals. For today's discussion, we are delighted to welcome leaders from each of our 4 partner organizations. Michelle Sampson, founding board member for Jewish Center for Justice. Michael Lawson, president and CEO of Los Angeles Urban League. Kerry Lopez, advisory board member of Hispanas, Organized for Political Equality, Hope, and Nancy Yap, Executive Director, Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment Cause. The conversation will be moderated by Dan Schnur, professor at USC's Annenberg School of Communication and board member at Holocaust Museum, LA. Holocaust Museum, LA brings you programs like today's discussion at no charge. So if you're enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org/donate or by becoming a member. More information about membership and a complete list of benefits is available at holocaustmuseumla.org/membership. It is now my privilege to formally introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan, thank you so much for helping us create Building Bridges program and for serving as moderator today for a special installment in this series.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And thanks to all of you who've joined us for this month's Building Bridges conversation. I'm really excited because we really do have a phenomenal panel today. Those of you who are with us on a regular basis, I know I've had the benefit of hearing the wisdom of Nancy Yap and Michael Lawson in the past, but today having my old friend my longtime friend, Kerry Lopez, from Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, and Michelle Sampson from Jewish Center for Justice. I think it's a real rare treat for us also. So we've got a terrific panel today. And I think a very interesting conversation. For those of you who are with us just a couple of weeks ago to talk about President Biden's inauguration and what his administration could be doing on these topics going forward, I look at today's program as a logical extension of that discussion. Because around the inauguration, we talked about what the Biden administration could be doing, what the president might do to help bring us together and move us forward, who are the voices inside and outside of his administration to help steer that conversation. And now what I think what we're gonna do today, like I said, I think will be even more important, because in addition to what the president and his appointees can do in Washington, much more importantly, I think you'd all agree, is what we can be doing ourselves in our own communities to bring our communities closer together so we can move forward to achieve our common goals more effectively. And so Nancy, if it's all right, I'm going to start with you. And I'll ask that very, very broad question. How can our communities, in order to work together better, we need to learn how to talk to each other. So Nancy, my question to you to kick off this discussion is, how can our communities learn to talk to each other so we can move forward together?
Hi, thank you, Dan, and thank you for having me here again on what, with this question in particular, pretty aptly named Building Bridges. I've been thinking a lot about this question just generally in our work and in our partnership with everyone on this panel today. And it actually really kind of, what had been happening with GameStop and the stock market really helped me to see some of the way that I want to frame or think about what building bridges could be. I felt like, what was all of with very little of the intricacies of what happened in the market itself, just this improbable group of folks who came together with an action, some for very different reasons than each other, but really with a goal to upset a status quo that some felt was unfair, some felt there was an opportunity, but I think they did realize that doing this thing together could create change. And I think that is a lot of the way we approach coalition building. Is we may have different reasons or different lenses for why we want to see change or the change we want to see. But if we find that there's something we could do together, how do we mobilize quickly, but also continue to also respect those differences and reasons, because there is a lot of outcomes from the change we're all looking for. So I believe that part of moving forward together is also learning and respecting those different perspectives, but realizing we have some goals in common, and how do we create even the most improbable alliances to really move forward as well.
Nancy, thanks so much. And so Carrie Lopez, as I said a moment ago, we're just thrilled to have you as part of this Building Bridges conversation. And we hope you'll be back again in the future. But for today, I'd like to ask you to pick up on the question that Nancy began to address, how we can learn to talk to each other so we can move forward together. And one point that Nancy made that I think is a particularly important one, and I know it's one that you've thought a lot about, is finding that common ground. And as you've done so effectively at Hope in the Latino community and beyond, is helping people from different backgrounds identifying and building on a common frame of reference. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk to our audience today a little bit about how to do that, the challenges that exist, and maybe some of the opportunities as well.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for letting us be part of such an important conversation. And I hope this is only the beginning of our recommitment based on all of our experience of what needs to continue to happen. My work with the Hope organization and their leadership development of leaders throughout the state is based on the learnings of another organization that's even older, that came out of the just past World War II. Coro, the founders of Coro, had to do exactly what this is titled, a relearning. We just won World War II, but we had to accept that as a country, democracy wasn't to be taken for granted, that it required advanced citizenship. And they worked with veterans coming out of the war to make this recommitment to understanding how democracy was to successfully function. And I paint that as a broad with a broad picture of where civil discourse fits into this beautiful picture of democracy. Democracy requires a lot of things. Civil discourse is one of them. Being able, as Nancy mentioned, to build successful coalitions with people that you might not normally agree with, but can find common ground. And the message that I want to stress is that this relearning is understanding that democracy isn't found in the virtual world or in a book. It's found in people talking to each other, and that discomfort of being able to find your voice and being able to respect other voices, learning how things work and how you can figure out how to make something greater happen than you ever realized. And that's the beauty of democracy and the promise of learning how to respectfully work with each other can produce something greater than you ever thought was possible.
Carrie, thank you so much. And as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm also really excited to welcome Michelle Sampson from Jewish Center for Justice to our conversation for the first, but hopefully not the last time. And so, Michelle, on this broader point of learning to talk together in order to move forward together, what I hear from both Nancy and Carrie is that building coalitions is important, but it's not easy. One of the things you and your colleagues have done, I think, tremendously effectively on behalf of the Jewish community is work very hard to build what Nancy calls these improbable alliances. Can you talk a little bit, if you can, about that coalition building effort, what your experiences have taught you about it and its importance?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and to be in such esteemed company. As Dan mentioned, the core of the work we do at the Jewish Center for Justice is coalition building, and Carrie and Nancy made reference to that as well. And it's about finding common ground, about working on behalf of everybody, the issues that affect us all. So whether it's hunger, or transgendered rights, or BLM, it's about finding that common ground, because in the Jewish community, if something affects one of us, it affects all of us. And we want folks to stand up when we're marginalized, when we're pitted against bigger forces. So we have to stand up for other folks. And one of the things I always think about is the BLM protests last summer, and how it was just really a rainbow coalition of multi-generational, multi-ethnicities. And it was such a beautiful thing to see. People who maybe hadn't been spurred to take action couldn't look away, because we were at home in a pandemic seeing these atrocities that are committed by individual members of police forces. So to be able to bring everyone together and say, yeah, this is not right. And yeah, I can support police in my community, but I don't support this. This is not okay. This is not justice. So it's to be able to, a lot of times it's emotion-based, but really there's just right and wrong. Kids shouldn't be hungry. Kids in a pandemic who aren't going to school need to get their meals. They need to have equity in their high-speed internet access, and we don't want to leave anyone behind. And it doesn't matter if you're Black, white, Asian, Latino, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. These are human common values, and that at the Jewish Center for Justice is sort of our baseline for building our coalitions.
Great. I really appreciate it, Michelle. Thank you very much for your insights and for sharing your experience. Michael Lawson, I know you've been part of these conversations for many months, and you've heard me refer before to one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. Twain said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." So we do have a new president, but these aren't new challenges. But on one hand, this is something we've been doing or trying to do for a while. On the other hand, it is a new landscape, not just because of a new president, but new technologies and the new challenges and opportunities they come with that. Can you talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about how our communities can learn to talk together and navigate together familiar challenges on a new and unfamiliar landscape?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I always enjoy these conversations. I always learn something when I'm a part of it. I don't know the answer to your question. The fact is that I think that because of the items that you just mentioned, as people have said, we are more balkanized, more segregated than we've ever been. And this is in a city that is already one of the most segregated cities in America. One of the things that I note from time to time is that part of the problem with Los Angeles is that you can get up in the morning in the absence of a pandemic, go into your garage, get in your car, roll up the windows and lock the door before you open your garage. And you don't get out of your car until you're in your office. And you can pass through neighborhoods that you've never experienced, where you don't know anybody. There are language barriers. I believe I saw a statistic saying that there are 180 184 languages, 885 languages spoken in Los Angeles. And so we live in this box where we don't necessarily have to interact if we don't want to. Compare that with New York, where you get on the subway and everybody's around you. So it's you take that environment and you overlay that with the ability to talk over the internet with only those people who mirror what your mindset is, and you have a recipe for a situation where the segregation is even worse than is getting worse, not better. And when I was growing up, they talked about Sunday being the most segregated day of the week, because people of the same faith would only go to churches that were populated by people that looked like them. I'm not sure that's changed a lot. Having said that, I'm hopeful that that we can recognize that and get past it. And Michelle, I'm glad you brought up the Rainbow Coalition and people who stood up and said no to the murder of George Floyd. The number of things that had to come together to make that happen were amazing, not the least of which was the fact that everybody was home watching television during this time instead of being at work. And it is experiences like that that give me hope that we're going to move beyond this. And in addition, sessions like this one, which are happening not just in Los Angeles, but I would dare say that no one is doing it better than Dan is doing. But we have to be intentional about crossing those lines and moving past that divide. Just this morning, I was having a conversation about redistricting, which in most states, following the census, there's a redistricting of the lines for political purposes, for governmental purposes. And so all these districts are going to be redrawn. California is one of the few states where that exercise is done by a committee of citizens as opposed to members of the legislature, where the governor and the members of the legislature, where they can gerrymander districts to make sure that they will get reelected. We have an opportunity here to ask how do we want to be aligned? We could draw these lines along ethnic lines, and I'm not sure that anybody would really complain. Or we could draw these lines so that various ethnicities are within a single district, and they have to elect someone who will represent all of the factors that live in that area. These are questions that we're having now, and I think these are questions that we should be happy to struggle with, because I think this is one of the steps toward building those bridges, taking down the walls of segregation that we have here within Los Angeles. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure that anyone knows the answer, but we are asking the questions, and I think that it's important that that people like the folks on this panel and the people that are listening are in that conversation, because there's some give and take that has to happen in order to make these things work, and it's all based on and understanding. And then I think everybody on this panel agrees that we're stronger together. And so how do we make that work?
Oh, Michael, I'm glad you raised the issue of redistricting. I've always believed that it is the least interesting word in American politics, but probably the most important one once you understand the stakes involved. And hopefully that can be a conversation that we have in a future program as California gets ready to draw its new lines. But what I'd like to do now is to take the conversation from the broader. You guys, I think, have all offered, I think, a really good overview of the challenge ahead. And let's dig in a little bit to more practical steps that we can take going forward. Because one of the things we hear most often from those who participate in our programs over the months is, what can I do? And Michael, I'll stick with you on this, because the advice that I've always heard you offer, both in these programs and elsewhere, is very simple and very direct, which is simply speak up. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to take that advice that you'd offered in the past and expand on it a little bit for the benefit of our audience members who do want to try to find a way to make a difference.
Thank you very much for that. It's as simple as that. I've been in one of the things that one of the roles that I held as a partner at Skadden Arps was head of the diversity committee, and one of the things that I experienced while in that role was the reticence that I found in so many different people in speaking about these issues, and there's a concern that you're going to hurt somebody's feelings and so on and so forth, but without conversation you don't have any change. So, but more importantly, what you saw on January 6th, and what you have seen in a number of situations where, in the Me Too movement, and when you look at the murder of George Floyd, there were 3 other police officers standing there watching, and I don't for a minute think that all of them had the same mindset of the officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck. I think in their minds they were, with at least one of them, they were appalled at what was happening, but he was afraid to speak up. I've had conversations with members of LAPD who have said similar things. They said, "Oh yeah, I've been in a situation where a partner said something or did something, but I leave that to the people with a higher rank to address that." And I remember reminding him, I said, this is why the Me Too movement is so powerful, because they said we have to speak up, and sitting by the sidelines and not saying anything, not calling out the problems that you see that need to be addressed, makes you part of the problem. And the thing that excites me about talking about this issue is that once you speak up, one of the things that happens is people listen to you. Everybody on this panel are people that are respected by their peers. I dare say that most of the people in the audience are people who are respected by their peers. And what I've discovered over the years is that we don't realize how much authority our voice has in these discussions. As I've said before, 80% of the people don't really do their own research. They listen to people that they respect. And we need to own that responsibility and be outspoken you don't have to yell people down. You just have to say, I don't agree with that. I think that's incorrect. I mean, I remember someone that I had a great deal of respect for said, I'm not sure if, or I don't believe we really landed on the moon. I said, yeah, we landed on the moon. And he said, well, if we actually did land on the moon, why haven't we gone back? I said, because there's nothing there. But you know, the fact that we had this conversation, and after this simple conversation, he accepted that statement, told me a lot about the ease with which people who don't do their own research accept what they hear, and the extent to which they respect people like the folks on this panel. They respect people who are on the board of the Holocaust Museum. They respect people who take the time out of their day to be a part of this discussion, even just as an audience. And I don't think we speak up enough.
I think that's right, and you made a great point earlier. Well, several, Michael, but one in particular said that many of us, particularly the type of people who sit on a panel like this or participate as an audience member in a program like this, don't realize the authority that their voice has. And so, Michelle, I think that's a really important point, that our voices do possess that authority, but often, at least individually, our voices don't possess the volume to be heard against the more extreme and the more combative voices. You talk a little bit, if you can, and you began to touch on this earlier, but if you can talk a little bit about how to collectivize those voices so they can have the kind of impact they deserve.
Well, I think to pick up on what Michael was saying, we're all our own authorities in our circle of influence. And some people might not be comfortable speaking out, but there's other things that you can do. You know, you don't always, depending on who you are, it might not be comfortable to stick your neck out, so to speak, but you can impact change with your vote. You can impact change at the local and state level, supporting policy and politicians that agree with you and that speak up for what your interests are and the interests of the common good. I think that's really important. A lot of times people say to me, well, what can I do? I don't have time. You absolutely have time. If you're a parent, you can introduce literature and pop culture to your kids that show a diversity of opinion and a diversity of experience. If you're home by yourself in the pandemic, you can make calls, you can sign petitions. I mean, there are things that we can do when, it's a drop in the bucket, but when we all do it, the bucket starts to overflow and then we can really impact change. Another thing to pick up on what Michael was saying, we need to start finding the nuance in these conversations. So often, and I'm guilty of it myself, we are painting people with a brush. Socialist, fascist, Trumper, this, that. We have to, and like I said, I'll point the finger at myself first and foremost. We have to do better within ourselves, within the people that we come into contact with the posts that we like, the links that we post, things that we share. Not everyone who likes a certain president is a fascist or against your civil liberties. It's sometimes hard for people to feel that way because we've been so emotionally charged for 4 years. But to have these nuanced conversations with Michael and his friend and the man on the moon, you could have been derisive and said, you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're this, you're that. No, Michael took the time to have this conversation and say, well, why do you think that? And what's behind that? And that's really hard because we've all been sort of traumatized over our divisions and what's gone on in the media, and we've been fed a steady diet of division. So it's really time, I think, to break that down and start having more nuanced conversations among ourselves.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's excellent advice for people who want to get involved but aren't quite sure how to do so. I think, Nancy, one of the things that we've talked a lot about already today is reaching out across lines traditional dividing lines into other communities. As Michelle said, not stereotyping someone simply because it's a convenient and an easy thing to do. But once we do start that outreach effort, and once we do decide that we're going to move forward and speak out together, it's necessary for us to understand what's important to members of those other communities too. Because even if our goals are the same, our motivations and our experiences aren't identical. And developing that cross-understanding, it seems to me, is really important. How do we do that?
I think, you know, both Michael and Michelle touched on this too, is one, I think in speaking up and wanting to speak up, sometimes that hesitation can come from not understanding each other's stories or not knowing each other's messages. And so what ways can we educate ourselves about both the process as well as each other's interests in a movement? I say that because we may all have different reasons we don't agree with, but we know that our communities are agreeing with a certain path forward. And so can we learn each other's stories to a point where we can tell them when we need to, so that we also feel educated about it, which I think will increase the confidence for it. And I am in hearing my peers speaking just now, I was just thinking about so much of the work we do is about a belief also that people can change, that people can learn, and that people can learn to speak up, but also hear our perspectives from folks who are really different or might have very different perspectives than us. So if we believe that that is true, then when we encounter someone who thinks very differently than us and almost aggressively so, that effort is about, do we want to engage and can we bring them over to at least hearing us out? I think that is part of the coalition building across as well, because we're going to need to I think that for me, I have so much hope in people being able to make that jump, people being able to hear us out. And so I bring that up because I think cancel culture is very common, and that people are afraid to speak because they're nervous they'll be attacked and then written off forever. But I know I'm a different person than I was a few years ago, and that I've learned a lot about work that I've been doing for a long time. And I think Michael said it earlier, I feel like I learn every time I'm on this call. And so I caution us against cancel culture, because I think these quick terminologies that put us into buckets prevent us from this larger learning and ability to move things forward. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Nancy. Carrie, I need your help. Okay, so we just heard from, three, well, and counting you, four very experienced, very savvy, very successful community leaders talking about how important it is to take these steps. But for someone who's newer to this, it's not that easy, is it? No. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you encourage people who are newer to this kind of activism to be willing to step outside their comfort zone, because it's not an easy thing to do. And I think when you listen to someone who's as good at it as all of you, it sounds easier than it is, but there really is a hesitation involved, isn't there?
Absolutely, and that confidence or lack thereof comes in two different ways. One, that you actually do have something to say. So it goes to everything that Michael talked about. You've got to speak up. You've got to have, what is it that your experience has revealed about what message you have, what motivation you have, what difference you want to make. That's coupled with your right to be at the table. A big part of Hope's mission is ensuring that at this decision-making table, wherever it is, whatever problem you're trying to solve, whatever you're trying to make happen, that the multitude of perspectives required to make that outcome the best it can be means that people like yourself have to be at the table for the discussion, for the actual decision, to make the case. And that requires a lot more than just acknowledging that it's supposed to work that way. People need help understanding how those systems work. They need to feel like they're not alone by the coalition that they're, or network that they're now part of, that gives them the confidence, knowledge, and courage to actually be part of it. But then there's an added responsibility, and this is what we have to remember, and Nancy brought it up, in terms of really being self-aware that you don't have all the answers, and that you can't just take for granted people's perspectives based on what they say or what they're posting. And that's this responsibility of always asking whose voice isn't part of this. What else do I need to hear about? What else do I need to really truly understand by experience, by checking it out myself? How do I keep expanding what I am learning? People always ask, Hope, what do you look for? Hope as an organization, what do you look for in these new leaders that you want to work with? And it's the same thing as any other successful leadership experience, is that you're looking for people who know they have more to learn, that they're self-aware to know that they've got, that they've constantly got to be looking to expand their knowledge of how systems work, how people work, how institutions work, and they have the humility to admit that there's a lot that they don't know. But to also have this sense of responsibility that they have to be involved. They have the responsibility as part of this democratic experience in democracy, that we never get to give up. We're persistent and we have empathy. And that's one of the key values that any successful leader has, is the empathy to always want to understand others, and to be able to be inclusive of them as part of the solution. And so that these are all practices that we can help both re-inspire ourselves, but also re-inspire others, that it's not as complicated, but it certainly is not easy. It requires a huge level of discomfort at times. That was my biggest learning about myself, is learning how to be okay with conflict, that always having faith that out of any conflict that was going on, of divergent opinions, perspectives, experiences, that something greater, if you just kept pushing at understanding where people were coming from and what was possible, that something greater was going to come out. And it was way better than just talking to people who you already agreed with.
Well, and I think of all the points you made, the one that really sticks with me, Carrie, is the willingness to learn.
Mm-hmm.
The willingness to admit that I don't know nearly as much as I thought I did, and the humility that comes with that realization. There's an old song lyric: "I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now." And I think the willingness to recognize that you haven't been part of all the conversations that you benefit from joining is a really difficult step to take. Michael, you've told me a story in the past about that journey within the African American churches of LA and elsewhere, as it relates to relationships with the LGBTQ community. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to take a couple minutes and tell us about that example, because to me, it's a perfect way of supporting the broader point that Carrie's making about being willing to get out of your comfort zone in order to accomplish something of import.
Thank you, Dan. It's one of those areas I think that's not unique to the Black church, in terms of not being open to certain communities when in fact they are supposed to be. And I think we have to accept the fact that we're not necessarily going to get through to the people that we're talking to in that conversation. I think the first thing you have is the respect that you have earned over the years that you've been on this earth and been learning and reading and trying to understand, and the fact that you are also open to perspectives that you didn't understand, that you hadn't heard before, and you're engaging in this conversation, and you're doing what you can to explain to whomever you're talking to why you don't share their views. And one of the magical things that has happened that I've experienced is that your message doesn't necessarily get across to the person that you're talking to, but it may get across to the person that's standing next to them. And I've seen it time and time again. The people on this call, the people in the audience, oftentimes we don't realize how much our voices are respected and who's listening. And the person that's listening may not be the person that you're talking to. And we're not going to save everybody. There are people who are not going to change their minds regardless of the evidence that you present to them. But that doesn't mean that you don't continue to have the conversation, because people that you don't know are listening to you and they respect you. And it is that knowledge, the first time I realized that even though I thought I had lost the argument with the person that I was talking to, later on, somebody who was just in the room listening came to me and said, "You're right, and I've changed the way I'm doing things because of that." I wasn't talking to that person. I didn't even realize that person was there. The impact that truth has on the majority of the population is real. There's some people who won't accept it anyway. We do what we can, use our voices and reason and rationality to move the needle for the bulk of the population.
I think that's exactly right. And I think the point that you just made, Michael, reflects something we talked about a little bit in our January program, which I think is worth bringing up in this context. For those of you who were with us for a post-inauguration discussion, I cited a passage, or a phrase from President Biden's inaugural address that, as I said then, I didn't think got nearly as much attention as it deserved, because the new president made a very similar point to the one that Michael just did. He said, enough of us need to come together so that all of us can move forward. And I think that phrase, enough of us, is of such critical importance because it's realistic. And look, all of us aren't going to come together. I'm not going to be able to convince QAnon or Intifa to come and become, to be a productive part of this conversation. But by lowering that bar of expectation to say enough of us rather than all of us, I think it also takes away one of our most easily leaned on excuses when we're talking about reaching across these types of lines. It's really easy for a Republican to say, I'm not going to work with the liberals because of those Intifa people. It's really easy for a principled Democrat to say, I'm not going to work with the conservatives because look at the QAnon and the Proud Boys. But if, as both Joe Biden and Michael Lawson have pointed out in slightly different ways, you don't need everyone to be part of an effective coalition. You just need enough of us. But to me, that's a really important step forward. So Michael, I'm really glad you raised the point, and I think it was one worth revisiting. Nancy, one of the things that I've heard you talk about before, which has just always really fascinated me, is for all of the critically important talk about reaching out across community lines, these steps toward tolerance that each of you have talked about. Often these are the types of things that some of us older members of our respective communities can learn from the younger members of our communities. Our children and our grandchildren grew up in much more diverse circumstances than many of us did. And so reaching out not just across community lines, but within our community, intergenerationally, can be of real value. I'm wondering if you could talk to that for our group.
Sure. I think for me, and this is something we see in the Asian and Pacific Islander community, and I think we also track because of the diversity of our community. So sometimes we talk along racial or ethnic lines, but I think there's also a moment around generational, not just age, but also around, and I think for us, we also talk about it because we have a high percentage immigrant population, also generation here in the United States. I say that because we all kind of use technology a little bit differently. Sometimes it's related to language access, like which conversations we can have where. I know in the API community, we do have what can be echoing chambers of people who found community and are sharing information in a specific chat room or on a specific platform. And so as we think about communications, I think also being willing to learn and include the different ways people use technology. And so, yes, there's a lot to learn from the younger members of our communities and how they navigate technology. But I think a lot of our older generation are also using technology in their own ways. And how can we start to include communication strategy that reach them too? So inclusivity and inclusivity strategies I think it's important for us to be creative and think about both directions when we talk about generation, and that different people use different platforms for different things. So I think social media can be a tool, not just for the youth, but also can help us find ways to also reach the older generation, and our elders who have shaped the way we do the work. So I think that that's really important. The other thing I just wanted to briefly touch on, because I think this is important in how we represent to younger communities what's worth the conversation, is what Michael was sharing around. You might not reach the person you're talking to, but you might reach the person next to them. I think the other thing that can be true is you might not reach them today, but you might reach them later. I think there's many conversations that I thought I lost. And I was like, man, I wish I didn't pick that fight, or I don't know if I should have spoken up at that time. And I think people become very gingerly like around me because they know I'm mad about a specific issue. I actually worked in underground hip hop. And so one thing was around homophobic language as well. But, once I stopped working in that industry, one of the artists reached out to me only a few years ago to share that he was wrong. And he apologized for the way he spoke about the community and that he was embarrassed about it. And that if it wasn't for me, he would not have done that work. And that was a fight I long thought I lost. It was like 10 years later, I was like, what are we talking about? And I think it's important for us to know that not just that the people around us have influence, but that sometimes even when you think you've lost, you might have planted that seed for growth and exploration in someone. And I think that's worth it too.
Nancy, we may have to, in a future program, come back to your experience in the underground hip hop world. I don't think we have time for that conversation today, but I think I speak for all of us that we'd love to hear more about it. But Carrie, I want to pick up on something Nancy said with you, if I can. But we talked about the value that younger voices in each of our communities can play in this conversation. But as impressive as a lot of these young people are, they're not necessarily prepared for the challenges of leadership at the outset. I had the great fortune last Friday to speak to your organization's HLI, Hispanic Leadership Institute, to talk with 30 absolutely extraordinary young Latina professionals preparing for leadership challenges. Talk a little bit about how, if we're going to engage the young people from our communities in these challenges, in these efforts, what do we need to do in order to most effectively prepare them to take on these roles?
Thanks, Dan, and thank you for always agreeing to come and share your knowledge and also inspire the women that we work with throughout the state. We will always be grateful to you for that. And it does take a village to raise a leader, and to continue doing so. One of the things that when you become part of Hope's mission and agree to take on this mantle of leadership is that you we implore these women not only to build the confidence in their own voice, their own perspective, their own message, but to have the humility to realize that they are representing hundreds of other women who do not have this this opportunity, that for a multitude of reasons, that they, in carrying this mantle, that they realize that it's not just them. And a lot of us believe that we're just expressing our opinion, and you have to remind everybody that they that this responsibility not only can feel daunting, but to try to use that sense of awe to inspire their continued learning and responsibility to keep growing our body of experience that we're pulling from. What do I mean by this? We forget how to agree to disagree. And some of us have never learned, and something that we have to continue being really good at. For a lot of our women, they walk into this room full of capable, accomplished Latina leaders that look like themselves, and they feel the pressure to just go along, to agree to feel like they're in a room of women who agree on every level of something that on their own viewpoints. And what we have to implore them with is that they will disagree, the insight that they will disagree today, tomorrow, and in the future with all of the women in the room, and that their greatest gift to each other is to continue being honest about where they disagree and how to continue working with each other despite that disagreement. And it's the hardest thing when you're looking at faces that look like yourself, to think that you're going to have to do that. And it's been an important part of our leadership development curriculum to be able to help people through that, to help our women through that. And we are always encouraged, as Dan mentioned, every year, just the desire these leaders, the desire they have to make a difference, and then the commitment they have to continue doing that, and all of the endeavors from their local communities to the state level. I wanted to elaborate on one thing I heard earlier. Actually, it was in the comments about, what do you do with all this hate that is in the no matter, and Nancy referred to it, that this is a process. You're not going to convince everybody all at this time to get along or to understand each other and so forth. It is a real process that goes on, and you have no idea the seeds that you're planting. And the what I always tell people, that it doesn't take courage to express your anger. It doesn't take courage to express your opinion or your perspective, as much as it does to channel any emotion you have in how you feel into a positive, productive, problem-solving solution process. That's where the courage comes in. That's where the courage comes in. So it does take courage to have your perspective, but more than that, it takes courage to do something with it, and to connect it to others, and to keep learning, and to be persistent on learning how to make a difference.
Really, really, really important point, and excellent advice. So thank you, Carrie. Mm-hmm. Michelle, I apologize because I'm not going to be able to give you the time you deserve, but I do want to give you the last word, because we've talked about this next generation. We've talked about young professional leaders. I work with college students, but I know you feel very strongly that we need to start even earlier than that to prepare young people for the challenges of leadership. How early should we be starting on this? Well,
I'm no early childhood expert, but I am a mom, and I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. So, you know, I think we need to start as early as possible. Representation matters, and hate and racism and anti-Semitism, you're not born that way. You learn it. So I think we can all agree on that. So I think as early as possible, you can expose your children or your grandchildren, grandnieces and nephews to characters and stories that show a different point of view. And I have a lot of hope to pick up on what Carrie was saying. I do have a lot of hope, even with the little ones, because they just, you know, they're very accepting. And when I've tried to distill things going on in the news to my 11-year-old, he'll just say, well, that's just dumb. Why do you hate someone because of this? Or why would they do that to George Floyd? That's just dumb. You know, I think inherently kids are so good and loving and not divisive unless it's over toys. So I think there's a real opportunity to start as early as possible and expose kids to this. I mean, in the pandemic, we've been watching a lot of really dumb old silly movies, but then we're watching a lot of, we just watched a movie Blinded by the Light, which is a true story about a Pakistani boy in the UK growing up with intense racism, and he found salvation through Bruce Springsteen's music. And my kids watched it with such sorrow. I feel so bad for this character, and it's just, I was really proud and happy that they're starting to recognize, like, this is wrong, this is not okay. And I think you could never start too young with that kind of material.
Well, Michelle, I'm going to cut you off before you deserve to be, but hopefully I can use that as leverage to convince you to come back and continue this conversation with us at a future date. One quick point I'll make before we leave: I always try to integrate the really smart questions that I get from our audience into the discussion with our panelists. But one of our audience members raises a really important point, which I do want to just take a moment to address. And he said, isn't this morning's conversation essentially a conversation among like-minded people? If you celebrate and support diversity and inclusivity, where's that diverging voice, that counterpoint to the same point being made repeatedly? And I do want to address that because it's an important one. And what I would say to Perry, but to all of those who've been listening to these conversations, is we look at the Building Bridges program as a first step, but only a first step. If we can find people from a range of different communities like these who can agree on a common set of goals, then we can work together to prepare each other and prepare ourselves for the even more difficult and more challenging conversations. So I think we would be remiss if we looked at building bridges as solving the challenges in their entirety. Rather, think of it as a way of identifying the common characteristics of an interest in moving forward. Look at this as a preparation for the next steps. And we'll be more than happy to talk with you going forward, either by email or in future programs, about where you can go to participate in even those more challenging conversations. But I think you'd agree that being fortunate enough to listen and learn from the likes of Carrie Lopez, the likes of Michelle Sampson, the likes of Nancy Yap, and the likes of Michael Lawson can help us understand why it's so important to have those more challenging discussions and how to best prepare to have them. So thank you, all of you for joining us today. Thanks especially to Michael and Nancy, to Michelle and to Carrie for being with us. Thanks as always to Safina and Wendy and the entire team at the museum for putting these programs on for us. And I hope you'll all be back to join us for our next program in the first week of March, when we continue to talk about building bridges and talk about how to best prepare ourselves and orient ourselves to take on those bigger challenges. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks.
Thank you.